Good morning, and thank you for having me here today. I really enjoy these kinds of discussions and conversations, and I think it'll be a productive one. I'm really excited to engage with you more. I'm Kyle O'Keefe. I work for the Solid Waste Authority of Central Ohio. I'll talk a little bit more about what that is in a moment. But really, the point of today for me is to kind of talk a little bit about what we do, kind of the strategy and approach that, as a Solid Waste Authority, we kind of take to this conversation. But I found it very fascinating and interesting, what we just heard in the survey. I think that was great. And I think part of the presentation today will kind of reaffirm a lot of those assumptions. And I think it also shows that we have a lot to learn from our countries, our neighbors, everybody else around us around the world. So again, we're the Solid Waste Authority of Central Ohio. We were created by statute in the late 1980s. This was around the time of the infamous trash barge. I think some of you will remember in here. And partly out of that visibility, partly out of the fear that Ohio was running out of landfill space, that these districts were created. There are about 52 districts in total. Some of these districts are multi-county, some are single county. You'll hear in a minute a little bit from Jenna, who's got the multi-county district right around here, and how this contrasts with Central Ohio, which includes all of Franklin County, and the rural and the urban factors are different. And I think you were learning a little bit about that in the Asian realm as well. So part of our duty as a solid waste authority or a solid waste district is to help to reduce reliance on landfills. And we have certain state goals in terms of trying to reach a 25% diversion goal with residential and commercial businesses. Things like providing access to recycling for communities, trying to educate and have outlets for other hard to recycle materials. These kinds of basic things are why we're around. With that, Franklin County and the Solid Waste District of Central Ohio is very unique in the fact that it also owns and operates a landfill. We're the only solid waste district in all of Ohio to own and operate a landfill. This landfill is also the biggest public landfill in Ohio. It's also one of the biggest in the country as well. I'll talk a little bit more about that. At the same time, our duty is to reduce reliance on these landfills. Some people see that as a conflict, but really from our vision, it's actually, we have a greater advantage to operate this landfill as an asset to the public. Our interest is in maintaining it as best as possible, extending the life of it by reducing the amount that's going into it, ultimately to ensure safe and adequate disposal for our communities for the longest period of time. So with that, every day I get to work right next to the landfill, and it's a very eye-opening experience to be there. This is a picture of our landfill. And you get to see it, you get to smell it, you get to really, it's really an eye-opener again. There's a million tons of waste annually comes to this landfill. So about 4,000 tons a day gets sent here. All of the waste in Franklin County goes to this landfill. So you really have a chance to engage with it and understand that there's a huge opportunity here to improve the way we see, we value, and we manage our resources as a whole. I think this is an absolute reflection of that opportunity that we have yet to realize. Personally with that, I see waste as either a liability that we have to manage that comes with the cost as well, or as an asset and a resource that we can utilize for our communities. And so this is something that I encourage everybody to come and see. And if the students would like to have a tour sometime, we'd be happy to have people to come and visit the landfill. We offer tours. But really, this is a cultural issue here. This is something that every citizen has the opportunity to act upon. The United States is actually the most wasteful country on this earth. And this is statistically speaking per capita. With 5% of the world's population, we consume 25% of the world's resources. We also generate 25% of the world's waste. This next point is kind of around data, but the U.S. EPA provides annually some metrics, some numbers around what we're doing as a country. And that's kind of a standard tool that a lot of people use. For the most recent data, which is for 2013, they said that we produce approximately 254 million tons annually across the country. With that, they have a certain calculation how they come up with that. There's actually an interesting study that was done also this year. I think it's the Environmental Research and Education Fund who did this study, and they came up with a whole nother number around approximately 100 million tons greater than what is assumed. So the point here is that data, good data, is really valuable in terms of managing our waste streams, understanding them, and being able to address them. And good data is hard to come by, and that's something that we're working on as well. This is just an anecdotal point, but food waste is the largest single type of material entering our landfills across the country today. It's also probably the least amount that's captured or diverted, at about 5% of materials that are out there. And this is a picture, this is actually at Ohio University. Maybe I shouldn't have said that, but this is an off-campus location, and when I was doing work down in that region, I mean, it almost makes you physically sick to see how much waste is being generated, and the opportunity, and there's a little person in there for scale. So back to data. I mean, this is kind of understanding our waste stream, a very valuable thing that we need to get better at and how we perceive it. But this is actually some data from that US EPA tool from 2013, kind of the general composition in terms of categories. And we don't always see our waste in these categories, so I think it's nice to see it in different perspectives. That really helps. But organic waste to containers and packaging, which we might all think, oh, well, maybe most of our waste stream makes up this containers and packaging because we deal with it every day, to non-durable goods, which are kind of goods that last between 1 and 3 years, depending. And that includes even things like paper or electronics and things like that, textiles, to durable goods with like appliances and furniture and other things. Everything can be waste at some point, basically, and we need to think more of it like that. This is just another way to look at it. And again, I think looking at it from multiple perspectives really enables value to be realized. I mentioned, that I'm not sure why that cell's blank there, but that's supposed to say about 1 million tons, and that's what's going to the landfill. But this is a general kind of graph that shows what we're generating in Franklin County. And about 30% of that, or about 400,000 tons, although 1 million tons is going to the landfill currently, we keep about 400,000 tons out. Of that, that's about 30%, but about half of that compost, or most of the compost, actually almost 95% of it is yard waste, strictly. There's about 5% of it that's food waste, which again helps us to realize the potential there to divert more food waste. And there's certain challenges there, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then with the recycling, about half of that, or about more like 60%, I would say, is generated from businesses, and the other 40 is probably residential. And of that, the majority of all of that is about 60 to 70% all paper and cardboard. But then a lot of the other materials are like electronics and textiles and other hard to recycle materials. But in order to address this in any way, shape, or form, and I think you'll hear this from a lot of district coordinators or anybody dealing in the subject, it really takes collaboration. I think that's the key, is that recycling and waste reduction is really a team sport across the board. You have to have everybody on the same page and working in the same direction. Otherwise, you're going to have minimal results. I don't know if anybody's heard of a collective impact or the model. It's a strategy, a term, a philosophy used largely in the nonprofit world. This is one that I come from the nonprofit background, and so it's something that we've been using quite a bit, but I'm using it here, and I'm relatively new at SWACO, so it's something I'm introducing. But within that, we have what's called a value chain as well. And this is not your typical supply chain, maybe how this stuff is being created, but who are your partners that see value in a similar fashion? These are just some examples of partners in our value chain that we're working with. But ultimately, we're going to these partners, these various groups, industries, associations, local governments, helping to build these common strategies, right? What are their goals? What are our goals? Where can we identify these? How do we measure in the same way? Because that goes back to data. Are we seeing the same progress? Are we measuring the same goals and having the same feedback? Are we working in the same direction in terms of activities? And are we communicating well? All of these things contribute to this collective impact model. Ultimately, that's tied together with a backbone organization or some type of intermediary, which I really see districts or SWACO in this case as a coordinating body. That's kind of our role. And we don't have a lot of districts and don't have recycling facilities or anything like that, but we help to work with these various partners to direct them and organize them. A lot of times we have funding mechanisms to help to pay for programs. We also have policy that we can create rules that help to create the guidelines that really shape and form these. And once you get people on the same page, there are key drivers, I believe, to kind of the waste reduction and recycling realm. These are kind of access and infrastructure, education and outreach, supportive and informed policy, and ultimately market and economic development. And these are kind of these categories that all connect, they all work together, and they're all very important. This first one, access and infrastructure, right? If you don't have access to use a system, be it recycling or whatever, you really can't do it. So food waste, all the above, if there's not an option for you to use, it's very difficult. That also has to have a certain degree of convenience to it as well, especially as a part of our culture. We're used to convenient things. But even when you have access, the other part that ties into the economics of all of it is around processing. And all these materials have to be processed. And so some of it's depending on maybe the extent of the distance or proximity to a facility that really has an impact on you. I'm sure as you begin to work more in this realm, you'll hear the term or acronym MRF or MRF. I don't know how many of you heard that yet, but you will. And that's a materials recovery facility. That's where all of your kind of single stream recycling goes to. There's a picture of one of them up here in your right-hand corner. That's a facility, actually it's a Rumpke facility, which is here in Ohio. And that's where they separate all this material and they process it. Well, that translates back to curbside recycling and everything else, that these have to be connected. It also translates to compost facilities and dealing with these hard to recycle materials. So a little static there. But anyways, part of the goal here is to get these systems set up. And if you don't have these systems, you really can't have as much of an efficient process taking place. And so we've spent a lot of time investing into these, and now they're kind of up to speed, but they ultimately have to be maintained and grow over time with the growth of the population and maintenance of the system and new materials. Education outreach of people largely still just do not understand what to even put in the bin. Even if you have a bin, I get this, you nonstop get this question. So it's difficult, and it has a real big impact in terms of contamination. I'm sure this is why separation is so good in many other countries. It's much more efficient. The better that you can separate it, the more value that it has. And so it has a big impact when there's a lot of contamination in that stream. And there's ways to address that by having consistent and common messaging, which is really yet to be accomplished in Central Ohio. It's also put up this little cartoon here, happy pretending you know what you can and can't recycle day. Actually, November 16th is America Recycles Day, or Recycle Day, and so I think it's relevant to the time. But people need help to do these systems. And they ultimately, above all else, need to have a personal connection with it. I think when they lack that personal connection, you ultimately don't fully understand what this is contributing to, the benefits or the impacts that it's having, one direction or the other. You notice I put here supportive and informed policy. A lot of policy that's developed is neither done in a way that has a common benefit for everybody. It's not often, but the more that good data becomes available and supporting information and voices from citizens are involved, the more accurate we can really drive these goals home. Simple things, and you're talking about policy with plastic bags, even from the requirement of having recycling curbside is something that's still developing in our country. But you can require businesses that submit, waste reduction plans, recycling plans. A lot of this pertains to zoning, even just to make sure that businesses that are being established or built have space for recycling. That's a huge issue when it comes to commercial recycling. The state of Ohio has some bans, some policies, some bans of material at the landfill. One of those is with yard waste. And so yard waste really does not need to go into the landfill. It makes sense, right? I mean, it's compostable, it generates methane, all these other things, let's keep it out. So that was something that was established quite a while ago and has been very effective and has been driving part of the process. People know to separate their yard waste, it gets recycled, it's connected to a market, it's a good policy. Things like tires, too, are another one to keep out of the landfill because you can't really compress them. They create a lot of volume. There are monofills for tires, but there's also markets for tires, too. But because there's a fee with them, it also associates with a lot of dumping because people don't want to pay for that fee. So there's enforcement. There's a lot of areas you have to address. I just threw extended producer responsibility on here, too. The more that you look at this subject, the more you'll come across it. It's a very evolving term in the U.S. Canada's taken it on a little bit further than we have, and it's evolving around the world as well. And that's really from a manufacturing standpoint that producers of these goods and responsibilities have a further responsibility to what happens with that product later. This often takes an extra step in the process as well because it requires a certain degree of separation or commitment or funding involved with it to manage those waste streams. But electronic waste is really one of the hot topics right now that are being talked about around the country. Food waste is being banned at some landfills on the east and west coast and other places as well. And the last being just kind of market development. Really, it has to make economic sense ultimately for these systems to work, especially here. And when I say that, it has to make economic sense on the front end and the back end. People have to want the service. Again, they have to understand it. There is a cost to it. There's a cost to landfilling as well. They have to want that, and there also has to be, on the back end, a market for these materials to make it move, to make it work economically. We're very fortunate in Ohio. We have a very robust recycling industry, probably more robust than most, and it actually enables us to recycle more types of materials than some others may have the ability to. I put glass in here. Actually, glass is something that a lot of places are dropping out, even across the country. We've had a lot of infrastructure and companies, investment to make glass a recycled product that we value, even though it has minimal value, actually, in terms of a commodity. I also just want to throw in here that in terms of collection and processing these materials, when it comes to like reuse and repair of products and goods, that actually has the highest value for a lot of these aspects in terms of dollar amount, job creation, value added to that. But the better that you can situate yourself with local markets, local uses for those goods, local processing, the stronger your system is going to be. I just wanted to build some awareness into this as well, that this is a commodity-driven industry. We're talking about recycling. I'm talking about recycling a lot here, not as much about reuse. I understand that. And I'm a huge advocate of reduce and reuse. But right now, the markets for recycling are some of the lowest on a downward trend, lower than they have been in a long time. And you'll see this goes back to 2008. And on the far left side, you'll see a huge dip. That was during the recession. The markets completely collapsed. And they steadily went up, and they went up almost to an all-time high at one point as well. And since then, over the past few years, they've been slowly dropping. And nobody knows when that's going to stop exactly, but it's having a huge impact on recycling as well. And a lot of people are getting out of the business. The ones who have a really good game plan are staying in. But it's a challenging time, and this is a reflection of a global industry and a global market. It's tied back to Asia. It's tied back to developing countries who are building lots of infrastructure and economies growing, using these materials. And when that slows off, it actually slows off around the world, especially here. There's also, you'll hear the term green fence, which also relates back to Asia in terms of this commodities markets, where you'll see a lot of this even at that peak. That's where this green fence actually started. And basically what it is Asia was getting a lot of these materials. In fact, exports, even during the recession, recycling, what is one of the biggest exports, continuing to be strong, even when everything else was going downhill. But really, they stopped accepting a lot of stuff because there was too much contamination in there. It was too messy. They didn't want it. They were a growing economy. They were generating materials as well. They didn't need it as much. But these commodities are still moving around, and Asia is still a very strong place for them. So I'm wrapping up here, but I'm just trying to hit on spots that might be helpful to you guys and help you to answer more questions. So again, these things are all just tied together. You have to see them as connected. You have to build them in a way that makes sense. And I just threw some kind of strategic priorities for where we are today, where SWACO is, and what we're doing. We're constantly working on improving the way that we collect data. I think that'll have big impacts for us centrally, and hopefully others that can learn from that as we invest into it. Increasing just basic education outreach, common messaging throughout is a huge opportunity for us as well. implementing best practices. There's a lot of tools out there. You don't have to reinvent the wheel to make good systems. So that people love to share that information. What I've found working in this industry. So ask for it, and it's readily available. Identify appropriate technologies and innovations. There's a lot of technology out there that says they can do a lot of great things for waste. Really, you need to know your economy and how that affects it. What's the environmental impacts, these other appropriate. So we're actually working with Battelle to do a study right now, should be completed at the end of next year, in 2016, that really benchmarks various technologies around the world, treating waste, adding value to waste, and what would be appropriate, from a community standpoint, from an economic standpoint, and fit into what we have going on in Central Ohio. Also develop a network of service providers and processors. That's your driver of all of this, and the more that you can build relationships with them, the more opportunities that you're going to have centrally to make a system work. And the very last one is there's just some key pieces such as food waste, and the commercial kind of sector of all of this really lacks a lot of the services that, or has lacked attention to a lot of these services in Central Ohio that we're going to be focusing on. So that's it. That was kind of long, but hopefully it gave a little bit of background and information that you guys can use and find useful. So thank you. Want to do any questions or good time or not? I don't know if we have. Right. Cool.
Thanks very much. What are some of the challenges for collecting food waste? So you mentioned that was one area that you're looking at especially, and is it related at all to the market for compostable materials? So that's a kind of a follow-up question. What is that market? I imagine, big ag uses chemical fertilizers and that sort of thing. It doesn't seem like there'd be a huge market for compost.
Yeah. There are markets for compost, for sure. There's a lot of composters, especially these yard waste composters who are established. They have a lot of those markets developed. I don't know specifically what the demand would be, or be able to, come up with some number for you or some percentage or how that would look, but there is a market for it. It's obviously not as high as a lot of other commodities. I mean, it varies, but there are landscaping, everything else needs to use them, needs to have access to them, and it depends on the quality of the material. When it comes to collection, the biggest thing with food waste is contamination, that it has a lot more contamination than yard waste, and so when you have to process that, that results in a lot of expense. And it becomes very challenging. And so the margins are so thin already that it really becomes a limitation. Also distance, when you look at something like Central Ohio and you try to find certain places around there that can take it, the farther that you're taking it, again, the more expensive it gets. So we really lack the infrastructure right now for processing food waste, and it's something that I think SWACO with its stakeholders are going to convene people and private business, look at different partnerships that might be able to be formed to establish something in Central Ohio, whether that's donating land or who knows, everybody pitch in a little bit to get something where it's going to work and, again, have that common, address those common goals and needs. So, but it's something we're going to focus on in terms of that. So, yeah.
What constitutes contamination in yard waste?
In yard waste? A lot of people still put their plastic bags in with their yard waste, which is something that's a kind of a big no-no. You don't really think of it like that, but it sneaks in, and I think that's probably the biggest contamination point with yard waste, and it gets caught up when they start to basically process the material. But I will mention with food waste, I mean, there's a lot that's developing there too, in terms of reducing food waste and capturing edible food waste and distributing that. So there's actually some great nonprofits that are going around and capturing that material. It's a growing focus, and there's some nonprofits again and volunteer-run organizations that are doing that.
I'm wondering, in Central Ohio, is recycling economically viable by itself, or is it subsidized, and if so, by how much?
It's not. They're curbside programs. I think they're just like any service. I'd say people pay for the service. Whether you want to call that a subsidy or not, that's just like they pay for trash. I don't see it as one, but it's completely privately operated in Central Ohio. We have some programs that offer recycling services that were offered before the curbside programs were established. So we're seeing if those are still necessary or not. They may not be as necessary. But no, it's completely privately run operation. Rumpke owns and Murph, and people take material there, and it runs all on its own in terms of the economics. I told you the economics are getting worse right now, but that's the commodities market. They go up and down, and they will come back up at some point, we imagine. So, yeah. All right. Well, wonderful. I'll be here if you have any other further questions, and feel free to contact me if you have any needs. Thank you.